So my name is Mike Anello. My username is ultimike on Drupal.org and pretty much everywhere else. Today, it's pretty much an introduction, as well as some best practices, as well as maybe a little bit of opinion on the best way to handle the configuration system in Drupal 8. So just a little bit about me. Drupal Easy is my company. We're a small company, 2 employees, a bunch of contractors, based in Central Florida, actually over on the Space Coast. I've been in the Drupal community for over 11 years. I probably spend about 50% of my time training, 50% of my time doing consulting, which falls under clients who I build sites for, as well as project coaching, where I basically come in and I kind of act as a guardian angel for a development team, make sure they're following best practices, help them get unstuck, provide training as they go, as they need it, with exactly what they need. And then kind of the thing that we're probably best known for is we have one of the, I think the original long-form Drupal training program. It's called Drupal Career Online. It's over 12 weeks, 3 half-days a week, over GoToMeeting. It's completely focused on Drupal 8. I'm really big into best practices. So students will be really big into best practices when they're done. We teach Composer, we teach a little bit of module development, information architecture, a little bit of theme development. There's office hours and homework, and it's a pretty intense 12 weeks. But yeah, in the end, students are, they're on the path to becoming a professional Drupal developer. So, end of advertisement. Okay, so what are we going to do today? Number one, we want to make sure we understand the basics. Right? In order to use the Drupal 8 configuration system, we need to have a good foundation, understand kind of what's going on behind the scenes. And then once we have a good foundation, we can, then we can figure out how are we going to use this for our organization. What makes sense for how to implement this the best. And then objective number 2, towards the end, comfort with common configuration system workflows. Well, I'll do a demo or 2 depending on time. Just kind of showing you the basics and kind of what the right way is to kind of move configuration around and manage it and not get yourself into too much trouble. So before I start, let me ask, how many people are using Drupal 8? Keep your hands up high. How many people have used the config system in Drupal 8? Okay, so small number there. Okay. How many people want to use the config system in Drupal 8? Yeah, it should be everybody, so you can all raise your hands there. Okay, so 2 big takeaways. If you're going to learn 2 things, here are the 2 things I want you to learn. But number 1, you could learn the technical side of configuration system. You can be a master at drush config import, config export, understand all the various contrib modules that are out there, understand what's going on under the hood. But if you don't have a process in place that all of your developers buy in on, it might as well be all for naught. The process is where the config system is really going to shine. Because if you have 5 developers who are, who have kind of committed to using the config system and 1 developer who doesn't, well, that developer can cause quite a bit of havoc. So it's really it's all or nothing as far as everybody who touches the site from a site builder role or developer role really needs to be part of the process. And it's also all of nothing on the technical side. When you are working with the Drupal 8 configuration system, the core tenet that you have to realize is when you do a config import or config export, which we'll talk about that, you're exporting all of the config on your site at once and completely replacing it. When you're importing config, you're not importing a text format or a field on a content type. You're importing everything. The reason why it's all or nothing like that is because Drupal's got a lot of dependencies. Right? When you create a content type with a field, with a formatter, with a configuration setting, that configuration setting of that formatter is dependent on the field, which is dependent on the content type. And all of those things are stored in different configuration files. So if you start trying to move some configuration files around, but not all of them, or importing some but not all, you can very easily break those dependencies and hose your site. So from a technical standpoint, importing and exporting config is really all or nothing. How many people have used features in Drupal 7? All right, so one way to think about the config system in Drupal 8 is it's one feature for your entire site. And you don't have a choice as far as what gets stored in there. It's all of your configuration gets stored in one feature for your site, which sounds scary, right? Because in Drupal 7, I knew when I used features, I'd have probably half a dozen features even for a simple site. But now we're talking about the config system is one feature for your whole site. All right, so let's go just to some basics, kind of level set everybody here. So Drupal database stores two types of data. Content, obviously, is one of them. The second one is, say it all together, configuration, right? And that's great, but it also leads to problems, right? So if you're a content author and you go to add a new node of type article, and you type in the title, the body, blah, 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 hit save, that's content. That gets saved in the database, hopefully, because we're a content management system. But also, if you go to your basic site settings page and change the slogan of your site and hit the save button, that also gets stored in the database. That's configuration. If you go to your views interface and tweak a view and hit save, clearly that's not content, that's configuring a view. But that stuff gets stored in the database as well. So the fact that both content and configuration are stored in the same place, that's kind of what leads to the issue of how do we move configuration around without also moving content around. So, and this is where we're moving towards opinion a little bit, just a little bit. It's a pretty strong opinion, so. Ideally, when you're working on your site, if you're doing anything other than content, if you're moving blocks around, if you're tweaking a view, especially if you're writing a custom module or working on a custom theme, if you're doing anything that's not pure content, my opinion is you should be doing that on your local. You should be doing that somewhere that if things go haywire, you're not working on a dev server, God forbid you're not working on a production server, you're not going to take anybody else down. We should be working locally when we do anything involving code or config. That way we can test it, we can make sure everything's solid before we move it kind of up the chain. Yeah, okay, so I use this image in pretty much almost every class I teach and most presentations I give. In an ideal world, code flows up, content flows down, right? So code, which in our case is also going to mean configuration in a little bit, code should always start off on a local environment. That's where it should be created or tweaked, right? You've got dev desktop or MAMP or WAMP or Drupal VM, whatever you're using on your local. That's where you're making your changes. That's where you're making your code or configuration changes. And once they're happy here, you could commit them to a repository, and then you pull them into dev, and you make sure it's cool in dev, and then you pull it into stage, or QA, or testing, whatever you call it. And then by the time you pass all those tests, you pull it into production, you're good to go. So code flows up. You would never, hopefully, go into production and tweak CSS directly on your production server. Number one, again, if you make a mistake, you're messing with a production site. But number two, how do you get code changes from here back down without violating this diagram, which you're all going to adhere to starting in 40 minutes or however long. So we always want to, everything I'm going to talk about is based on this premise, that we're working locally, pushing code and config up. And then on the other side, mainly we're talking about the database, but we're also talking about the files directory. The database should always be moved down. We should never take a database from our local and copy it up to dev, stage, or God forbid, production. Unless, of course, you're in the very early stages of development and there is no production environment yet and you need to kind of see that environment. I get that. But once you have all these environments established, you should never be copying data up. Because where's the canonical source of data? It's up here in production. You have a content author adding content, they're adding it up here. You copy a database from any of these up there, you've just hosed their content. So the idea is code up, we'll say database down, although talking about all content as well. So a minute ago, on a previous slide, we talked about the configuration, and I'll put the caveat in there. by default on a standard Drupal 8 install, the configuration is stored in the database. When we change a view on our local and we save that view, the configuration is stored in the database over here. So how do we get it from here up when we're going against that arrow? We're not allowed. Clearly, the way to move configuration, or the way to move things from a local up, is to get it into code. That's what the config system does. The Drupal 8 config system, in a nutshell, takes the configuration that by default is stored in your database and moves it to code. Once it's in code, you're in Git land, you can push, you can pull, you can go up your chain there. Everybody clear on kind of that basic so far? Okay. So obviously, I don't want to repeat myself, but without the config system, if we wanted to move config from local to dev stage production without redoing it through the UI, we'd have to copy the database. But copying the database, we could be overriding someone else's content. We could try and be clever and move some tables or some rows or write some SQL queries to move configuration around. You could probably make that work. I wouldn't recommend it. It's fraught with peril. So the idea is that the D8 config system provides a mechanism to export configuration from the database into a set of YAML files. And then once it's in YAML files, our Git version control system can see it. We can commit those changes, push them up through our environments, and then import that stuff from YAML files into the dev database, the stage database, the production database. OK, so we'll come back to this a few times, but this diagram kind of illustrates the process that we're talking about. So if this is our local Drupal 8 database, Acquia Dev Desktop, Lando, whatever you're using, this is on your machine. We change a view or something, we hit save, that changes in here. And maybe it took us 3 hours to figure out how to get that view working, and we don't want to have to redo it on dev or then redo it on stage and redo it on production, which we've all done, but we want to do it better. So what we do is we can run a configuration export command. I'm going to demo it with Drush. There's a Drupal console command. You can even do it through the UI, which I'm not going to show you because you shouldn't be doing it through the UI. So we're going to use Drush. So what this config export command does is it takes all of the configuration that's in the database, and it replaces all of the configuration in a special directory I'm calling config with the configuration here. So it takes all of this configuration, exports it into a series of YAML files. At that point, we're in Git land. We can do our git add commit push. Git add and commit, git push. And now those files are on a remote environment. We'll say dev, remote. So dev stage production in YAML files here. Just because they're there doesn't mean that view has been updated on that environment yet. Because remember, the active configuration for that site is still in the database. In order to get the configuration that's in YAML files, our new view, we have to run a config import command. And the config import command is more than meets the eye. Right? The export command is actually kind of simple. And I can show you. So this is a Drupal 8 database. There's a table called config. Inside of that table, this is zoomed, right? Inside of that table, for this site, there are 179 records. Each record is a configuration. So I'll go to one that's easy for us to kind of grok real quick. System.site. One of the things that holds is the site name. It's wrapping there, but it's highlighted. So what happens is, when we run that config export, every single one of these rows gets outputted as a single YAML file. So we're going to end up with 179 YAML files. The name of each YAML file is going to be the name of the configuration. So this YAML file is going to be called field.settings.yaml. The contents of that YAML file is going to be this stuff. This is a PHP serialized array. And the YAML file, it's going to be YAML. When you do a config export, that's all that happens. Drupal core does a SQL query for every record here, loops through them, generates a file. Import, on the other hand, this config import actually does a bit more. Not only does it read all these files and imports them into that same config table, well, first thing it does is it wipes out that config table, all or nothing. It's not a merge of config, it's an all or nothing. So it takes all these YAML files, brings them into that config table. But along the way, configuration could lead to a new content type. It could lead to modules being enabled. It can lead to a lot of stuff. So if you just do a config import, yeah, OK, you have the config in there. But if your config specified a new content type, that content type actually needs to be created. And there's a process there. Drupal has to create some tables and fields and do all of its Drupal stuff. So config import can actually do quite a few things. All right, so far so good? OK, so as we're talking about this, we've kind of only talked about the technical side so far. And we'll do a couple demos to show it a little bit more. But I think what's really important is that for this to really work, we need to talk about the process a little bit. So as developers, and maybe as site builders, if you're a site builder who is comfortable using Composer to download modules and dependencies or Drush, you're probably also comfortable using Git to commit those new modules to your code base. Well, what I would argue is that you need to make the config management of your site, you need to think about config management the same way you think about code management with Git. So when you sit down in the morning and you start a new task on your project, and you're working locally as we're supposed to, what's the first thing we do? We make sure our code is up to date, right? We do a git pull. So we make sure the code on our local is synced with the code in the repository for our whatever branch we're on. We'll just stick with master for now. Well, I would argue that you need to add to that process if you're going to go all in on the config system. That not only do you have to make sure your code is synced, you have to make sure your config is synced. You have to make sure that there isn't anything that's in those YAML files that your database doesn't have yet. And I think I'm talking about these backwards, so according to my slides, let me skip to this one. So we're used to doing these git pulls, and our code is all up to date, and hopefully our database is relatively up to date, and boom, our code is synced. We start working away on our theme or our module or whatever. Well, I'm going to argue that right after you do that git pull, you need to import configuration as well. Because there might be changes that you just brought down in that git pull. There might be changes to your configuration as well. So in order for those changes to be reflected on your local, you need to import them as well. So it's a bit of a mind shift, or just an addition to our process, that when we do a git pull, we should be doing a git config import. And at the end of a task, when we're ready, when we're happy with our code, or we're happy with our changes, and we do our git add and commit, we should also be doing a git config export. So any changes we made that affect config also get captured. So we do a config export, then we do a git add, that captures configuration as well as whatever code changes we made, and then we commit, and then we push those. So the process really has to be, if you're going to use a config system, you have to develop a process that makes sure that everybody has the latest configuration as well as the latest code. So syncing config needs to be part of your development process. And in my experience, this is the bigger hurdle. The technical side, as you're going to see, the commands are not that difficult. The concepts are, I hope, not that difficult. Where I have seen things be difficult is making it part of your process. All right, so let's get down into a little nitty-gritty of some details real quick. So we talked about, any questions so far? It's a lot of content for 45 minutes, so just want to make sure I'm not losing anybody. All right. So we've kind of seen the process, and we know, we're all familiar with the database, but let's talk about this config directory. Where does that live? How does that work? Well, in Drupal 8, we can configure the location. I should say we can set the location of that config directory in our settings.php file. If you're building a Drupal 8 site, I think the recommended best practice, I know for me and a lot of other people, and of course it's not going to be in my, is the Drupal Composer Drupal template. Should have preloaded that one, sorry. So if you're building a Drupal 8 site, hopefully you're using Composer. If you're using Composer, this is the best starting point, in my opinion. It's a Composer template which makes Drupal core a dependency of your project. One of the things that this Composer template does, I can talk about this for the next 45 minutes, but I won't. One of the things this template does is it automatically, so the site I'm going to be using today is called depanth config. But one of the things it does automatically is it gives you a config directory. A config directory that is above the doc root of your site. So this is our project directory over here. This is our Drupal root over here. So here's all the Drupal in here. On the same level, there's a config directory where all of our exported config is going to live. And so Git is keeping an eye on all of this stuff, including that config directory. So when we do a drush config export, that config table gets exported from that database into a set of files in this directory. And if you don't like the location or the name, you can change it in your settings.php file. So let's actually see that much in action, because it's pretty straightforward. So what I have here is I have a local site. I'm using Doxel as my local. So I have a local site, and then I have on Pantheon, I have a dev site, and I have a test site. So they're all identical. I just synced everything a little while ago. So the first thing we want to do is we want to come to the configuration synchronization area of Drupal 8. This is everything I'm showing you right now is part of core. You come here and it tells us there's no configuration changes to import, which is a little bit of a lie because we don't have any config in this directory yet. So when you first install Drupal, all your config lives in the database. There's not going to be anything in this directory until you export it. So let's come here. Is that big enough? Oh, clear. All right, so I am going to cd into the web directory. And I'm using Doxel, so I prepend all my drush commands with fin. Ignore the fin. Drush config export. All right, so this is the easier of the two commands to understand. All this does, takes that config table, every row, exports it to a file, converts the config from serialized PHP into YAML. All right, so successfully exported. Ignore the path. It's because it's a container, so it's a whole thing. So as we saw before, there's 179 rows in our config table. There's now 180 files in our config directory because there's an htaccess file. So it's a 1-to-1 ratio. And if we look at one of these, I'll go down to that site, that system.site one. Open this up. So obviously that's a heck of a lot easier to read than serialized PHP. But here's our site name, here's the email address, there's no slogan. Pretty much everything on that basic site settings page is here. So one thing to keep in mind, by doing that export, this is not live configuration. If we make a change here, if I make a change here and save it, nothing's going to change with the site. This is an exported view of the active configuration. The active configuration is still in the database. Okay. Exit out of that for now. All right, so let's kind of walk through this whole process. We're going to make a change on our local. We're going to export it. We're going to commit it to our repository. We're going to push it. And then we're going to go to a remote Pantheon environment. We're going to import that change in, and then we're going to see it there. So I'm going to make a super simple change. But you can imagine, and now that we've done the export, this page doesn't change, but now it actually is true. Because there's actually, all this page does is it compares the config in the config directory with the active config in the database. And this page, by the way, really useful, but I'll give you some tips and tricks to actually understand what the hell it's saying, because it can be really confusing. What the heck it's saying, I'm sorry. I'm being recorded, so I have to. Okay, so let's come here and make a super simple configuration change. But you can imagine nothing I'm doing here would be any different if we added 4 content types, 13 views, text formats. You know, we could spend 8 days changing configuration on our local. The process I'm about to show you is exactly the same for all that configuration versus one little bit that I'm about to do. So here, so let's just change the slogan. There we go. Welcome to Drupal Camp Atlanta. So we're just adding the slogan. So we hit Save Config. All right, so remember, at this point in time, that config change only lives here. Active config is in the database by default. If we go back to that configuration synchronization page now, we have all this yellow text, which is, spoiler alert, ignore it. Never pay attention to the yellow text on the configuration synchronization page. I wish I could explain to you where all of this data is coming from, why the config system thinks these have all been changed. I have not been able to find anybody to give me a good reason for it. So if you learn maybe 3 things today, the third thing that you should learn is never pay attention to this part of the configuration synchronization page, because it will mislead you and confuse you. What you should pay attention to is the stuff on the bottom. And this is telling us that there's been it detects a change to a single configuration file, the system.site file, which shouldn't be a big surprise since we kind of opened it a second ago. So it's basically saying that if we were to import configuration, if we were to run config import, and this is where there's a lot of confusion with this page. When I come to this page, I always say, in my head, I say to myself, if I were to import all, if I were to either click this button, which is the same thing as doing a config import, if I ran config import, one configuration would change. How would it change? Well, we can view differences, and this leads to even more confusion, I find. It's a diff. If you're comfortable looking at diffs on the command line, or in Kaleidoscope or something like that, all this is a diff. But we have 2 terms up here which aren't super crazy helpful unless you really understand the nuts and bolts of the config system. So I'm going to simplify it for you right now. I've been using the phrase active configuration on purpose. The active configuration by default in Drupal 8 is in your database. So what's on your left, active, is what's in your database. This is the configuration as it stands in the database right now. The staged, and again, I can explain to you why that's called staged. In my opinion, it's an edge case to call it staged. It really should be sync, or the config sync directory. But staged, translate this in your head, this is your YAML files. So this is what's in your database. That's what's in your YAML files. If we were to do a config import at this moment, we would lose this, and we would add this, meaning we're going to lose our slogan. If we do an import, we lose our slogan. So it's kind of looking at this. Imagine we're local here, but as of right now, our slogan exists in, well, I'm going to point to here for now. Our slogan exists here. Our slogan is not in here. If we do a config import, we're completely replacing all of that config with all of this config. And this config does not have our slogan. So this is how, with a config system, people lose stuff. Right? You do a config import, and you're basically completely replacing what's the configuration in that environment. So if I come here, and I'm gonna go ahead and do it. So if I do a fin drush config import, it's going to ask me if I want to make that change. That's the only one it detects. We're going to say yes. Take that config from the YAML, bring it into the database, and lo and behold, this page is going to look nice because we're going to be all synced again. But we've lost our slogan because the YAML files had no slogan. So we'll talk about how to avoid this in a couple minutes. But for now, let's go ahead and change the slogan again. Save it. Come to the config sync page. Still have the one change. And of course, we have a completely different set of files here. This is why we ignore it, because it makes no sense. So now let's go through our actual process. We're going to go through the whole thing here. So we're going to do our config export. So we're going to go from the database into YAML files. And after you do an export, you better be clean, right? Because you've just copied one to the other, so they should match. So that's why we're clean here. And just to confirm, again, we're not changing active configuration. We're just exporting it somewhere, so our slogan is still there. So now we can do a get status. Oh, I forgot to do something. All right, bummer. When I did my original config export, I should have committed all the, oh no, I should be okay. No, I'm okay, never mind. Phew. All right, so here's our, oh shoot, come on. So here's our get status. Git sees one configuration file changed. Obviously, it's our system.site one. We can do a git diff. And no big surprise here. The old YAML file had no slogan. The new YAML file has a slogan. That's the change we want. That's the change we want to push up. So git add /config, git status, git commit. Little rule of thumb, I always preface git commit messages that involve config with the word config. So if you ever have to look back at your history, it's easy to find the ones involving configuration. So updated site slogan. All right, so what did we just do? We basically we committed here. So now we're going to push. Git push origin master. Okay, that got pushed. We'll watch the commit come in here on Pantheon. So this is, Pantheon does an automatic pull to the dev environment, so that's what's happening here. So it's pulling that commit in. So what just happened there is our push and the Pantheon implicit pull. So our updated YAML files there on our dev site. Here's our dev site. If I reload this page, we're not going to see our slogan yet because our slogan's only in here. And Drupal's active configuration is in here. So we've got to import to get our configuration from here into here. So again, we're going to come to the config sync page and craziness in there, but we have one change. Let's view the difference, and now it's the exact opposite of what we looked at before. The active, or the database, doesn't have a slogan. The sync directory, or our YAML files, that's where our slogan is. So now we want to do a config import on the remote site because we want to pull this from the sync directory into our active config. So I'm going to use terminus, similar to drush alias. So all this is really doing is basically running a drush command against my dev environment, and the drush command is config import. So a little Pantheon warning, say don't try and change the code base with this drush command. If I hit this, yeah, okay, so I can push this up a little bit. So the config import sees that the only thing that's different between what's in the active config and what's in the YAML files is this one file, which we expect. So let's go ahead and import that one in. Configuration was imported successfully. So again, in our dev environment, we just didn't import. We just copied one to the other, so we better be synced. And we are. And we have our new slogan. So that was a very simple configuration change, but like I said, this configuration change could have been 4 content types, 3 views, and what else? Process would not be any different. Command would not be any different. OK, so let's see, how do we get into trouble? So we can get into trouble where if someone on the dev site says, I need to make a change on a dev, I need to put a view on the dev site. So I'm going to create this awesome view. And it's going to be so awesome, it's going to take us 30 seconds to build. That's how awesome it is. So here's someone who hasn't bought in on the process, or is unaware of the process, or hasn't been trained up on the process, or who, someone who's not making a change on their local. Which, for your organization, that might be an actual real use case. Everyone's not going to be, schooled on, how to export config and how to manage config. But if you're making a change in a remote environment, what you have now is you've got a config change. And I call config changes on remote environments as config changes that are hanging out in space. Because as of right now, there's a config change in this database. It's not committed to YAML files. It hasn't been exported. And unless there's a process in your organization that basically dictates that anytime someone makes a change on a remote environment, then developer Y needs to export and commit that. Unless that is part of the process, this config change is on borrowed time, or could be on borrowed time. The reason is because another developer who's doing their job comes over to a content type and they have a new task. I need to change the label from above to inline. I need to make, and I'm doing things the right way. I'm working locally. I tested it. Everything works good. Again, I'm on my local site. I've got a config change, blah, blah, blah. That looks good. I'm going to do the right thing here. I'm going to come to my local. I'm going to do my drush config export. There's my configuration change, looks good. Git status, git add. Tweaked field label. I've already broken my one rule, so let me go back, or my third rule. Git push origin master. Now, even though I'm doing my job right, I've made my change on local. I'm pushing it up. I'm pushing it up. It's going in here. If I wasn't careful, this worked a second ago. Come on, let's go. Still online? Oh, don't do this to me. Oh, it switched. Oh, you rotten. That's all right. There we go. I've got 5 minutes to get the internet back up. Okay, I'm going to give this about 30 seconds. Oh, really? It's down? Okay, well, you can imagine then. We do our push, and then, we can very easily get into the habit of, I pushed up to dev, I'm assuming everybody else is doing the right thing, so I'm going to do my config import on the remote environment. It must have just went down because we were just on it. And as a remote environment, if I made that push up, this would have 2 entries. I'd have this one, but then I'd have the one for the field label change you just made. Fantastic.
It's nice to get that instant feedback.
I know. Is it? Come on. All right, I'm not going to worry about it. I'll come back to the remote environment. So if we made that push up, now we're going to have 2 config changes. We're going to have the one that was made directly on dev that we don't know about yet, and we're going to have the one that we changed. So we'll have a removed section, which we're going to talk about in 10 seconds, and a change section. So how do we read? What does that removed mean there? So I think this word is just as misleading as active and staged. What removed means is if we do a config import, this will be removed. Just like if we had our push made it up, if we do a config import, our field label visibility will be changed. So when we do that config import, because this view only exists in the database, and a config import is all or nothing, it completely removes the configuration of the database and replaces it with what's in the YAML files, this view will go away. So is GitHub up? No.
If you do Wi-Fi off and then Wi-Fi back, I want to be
All right.
kills all the stuff.
Come on. All right, it's okay. That's all right. So what's the lesson for this bit? The lesson is before you do a config import, and I would argue before you even start a task, go out to your remotes and make sure that there's no config changes hanging out in space. Anytime a config change is made in a remote environment, there needs to be a bulletproof process to get that into the repository as quickly as possible. Because the reason people lose configuration with the D8 config system is because they do a config import without realizing that someone else has made configuration changes on that site. So to solve that, we can solve it one of 2 ways. Way number 1 is what I just said. If a config change is made in a remote environment, get it into Git. Whether you train all of your site builders to do that, or the site builders know enough that if I make a change on config, I have to open up a ticket for a developer to export that config for me. That's a bit of a process, though, right? Here's what I recommend. Oh, it's up. OK, fantastic. OK, good. We'll go 5 minutes over. All right, so we got that. Coming in a few seconds ago. Reload this page. Is it not in there yet? Come on. There we go. OK, so here's we're hiding the label. Here's our view that we're losing. If we weren't paying attention to this, let me do it this way. and I do my config import on that remote site, I'm losing our awesome view because we weren't careful, or because we didn't have a process in place to get that change into our repo. And it'll even tell us here. So we've got a bunch of chances to notice that we're about to screw someone up. It's telling us it's going to be deleted, but we'd have to catch it. And even if we catch it, then we have another problem, which we won't have time to get into. But even if we catch it, now we have to figure out, well, how do we get that into the repo without losing our change? Because we've got a change there, we have a change here. So now there's a little bit of a merge we have to do, which is outside the scope of a 45-minute session. All right, so we've done that import. We're synced up. So I would argue that, and this is the phrase I always use, is if you can get away with it, there's a contrib module out there. It's called config read only. And what it does, and I recommend it, especially if you're just starting off with config management, it's kind of like a training wheels for config management. What it does is it locks down remote environments, so you can't make config changes on remote environments. It makes it so that you can't go to the basic site settings page and change the slogan. It forces you to make that change in local, which coincidentally is what I believe is the way you should be doing it anyway. So config read only is like a big hammer that is enforcing the process of developing on local. So so what I'll do is, I got a couple minutes. I'll actually enable it on my local.
So while you're doing that, can we ask a question?
Sure.
So if you're going to start teaching folks like the beginning part of how to deal with DCATL, do you start by saying, hey, you're going to need to do this too? You're already committing to let's get you in the habit of doing this now?
I think this is if you're building a Drupal 8 site, there's two big changes you should be making to your processes. Number one is Composer, and that Composer template, because it gets you all kinds of goodies. The config, automatically creating a config directory is a minor thing it gets you. Number two is building config management at the ground level. I think. I'm a big proponent of it. So, all right, so the config read-only module, you can enable it anywhere, and it won't, we're not locked down. It actually requires a little bit of a tweak to your settings.php file to lock down a site. Because enabling or uninstalling a module is a configuration change. So you can imagine if you enabled the config read-only, you'd have no way of unenabling it or uninstalling it. So there's a little bit in your settings.php file to actually turn it on. So I actually have that bit in my settings.php, so it will lock down config in our test environment, just to see what that's like. So I've made a config change. I've enabled the module. So I'm going to export that change. And I'm not going to look at the config sync page just to save time here, but we'll see the change here. So core.extension is where all of our enabled modules are listed. So we'd expect the change in there, which we do. See? All right, and I'm just going to do git add config, git status, git commit-m, config enabled config read only, git push origin master. And so while that's pushing, I can show you real quick that little snippet of code just to know it's nothing to fear. So hosts like Pantheon and Aqua Cloud and other hosts, they'll provide you environmental variables. So basically all this is saying is if the site is running on Pantheon and it's our test environment, then enable config read only. So this way it's not enabled on dev, it's only enabled on test for this example. Again, if you're just starting out, I'd put those big training wheels on and basically get rid of this line and anywhere remote, turn it on. It's a good way to learn it, I think. Okay, so Oh, did we lose it again? Come on. Our push went, right? Our push went. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. All right, so our dev site, we're still good, right? And we'll see when config read-only is enabled, we'll get a little message up here saying config is locked, and our save configuration button will be grayed out. So we're still good on dev. We can still screw with our developers on dev by changing config and not telling them. But here on the test site, well, let's push it up to test. So remember, this is on test, it's a manual process to do the pull. So what we're doing right now is we're pulling our updated config into the test environment's config directory. Come on, you can do it. All right, well, and then I'll come back to this in a second while this is doing its thing. I know I'm keeping you guys, so let me just finish up here with. So, tips and tricks. This is what I've learned from, a year and a half of using the config system pretty regularly. These are kind of entry-level introduction tips and tricks. Number one, use config read-only, especially if you're starting out. Once you kind of understand the process more and where to be careful and what to watch out for, this is kind of a great way to start using the config system in Drupal 8. And I have the live environment. Since I wrote these slides, remote environments. I actually feel stronger about it every time I give this presentation. When config changes are made, if you're not using config read-only, when there's a config change in a remote environment, get it into your repository ASAP. Get a process in place to make that happen. Before working in your local environment, this is what we talked about earlier, do your git pull, then do a config import. Get in the mindset that our code has to be in sync and our config has to be in sync. Similarly, think about switching branches from master to feature branch. Think of that the same way as pulling fresh code. When you switch branches, your code base is changing. So import config. Before you change branches, that's like doing a push, because your code base has changed. Do a config export and commit it. Whenever you switch branches, config import. This one has helped me. When you have a commit that includes config changes, I like to put the word config in there. Going back and looking at your Git history becomes a lot easier to pick out which ones are code, which ones are theming, which ones are config. Ignore the yellow text on the config sync page, because that'll make you bang your head. All right, so those are those. Let's see if this finished. Yep, that got finished. So we've got some changes here. So this is everything we've done for the past 45 minutes. One of them is enabling config read-only. So let's just do our last thing here. We'll do a config import, this time on test. So we're going to basically, and what I'm doing through the command line is the same thing as using this button. I'm just used to doing it on the command line. I think it's a good practice to get into. So we're going to import those 3 configuration changes. So we're going to get the new slogan. We're going to get the fact that our label is hidden. And we're getting config read-only turned on. And you can see that when it brought in our core extension config change, it installed config read-only. So that's the example of config import doing more than just copying data over. It actually is doing stuff. So now we come here. We better be synced because we just copied one to the other. We're synced. And now we're locked down as well. Config read-only is now active. So any configuration form on the site, we cannot save. So these are the training wheels. This prevents us from losing configuration changes on remote environments because we're not allowing configuration changes on remote environments. So by not allowing them, there's nothing to lose. And depending on your organization or your client, this might be reasonable as a long-term solution. I definitely have some clients who I've convinced that we're keeping production at the very least locked down. So any changes they want to make, we're going to go through our process that we put together. But you might also have the case where the client needs their content admins to move blocks around. And there's a couple solutions there. There's a couple of contributed modules that you can maybe work with that a little bit. But if you're just starting out with a config system and you kind of want to walk before you can run, this module is the way to do it. And I think I'm done. OK. So, all right, any questions? All right, very good. If anybody wants a sticker, Florida Drupal Camp, anybody wants to ask me questions, I'm around the rest of the day. Have a great rest of your camp.